In the dying light of the desert, where storms gather and silence holds its breath, a lone riderless figure stumbles from the horizon, and a cowboy's quiet world is about to change forever. The New Mexico territory lay wide and silent beneath the weight of late summer heat. Wind moved over the land in low sighs, lifting dust from the hard earth and carrying it in ragged veils across the horizon. The sky itself felt endless, blue burned pale by sun, clouds smudging faint gray in the distance like the promise of rain that never quite came. Elias sat where he always did at dusk, on the porch of his weathered cabin, his boots planted against the step, the old rocking chair beneath him creaking with each shift of his weight. In his hand he held nothing, for the coffee pot had run dry hours ago, and he had long since learned to endure the long evenings without its comfort. The rifle above the mantel inside was his truest companion. He oiled it often, not out of fear but out of habit, the way a man tends a horse he no longer rides. War had taught him that steel and powder had their own kind of memory. And Elias himself was no stranger to memory's bite. The silence of the ranch was heavy with it. The years when laughter had lived here, when a woman's shawl had hung by the fire, when dreams had stretched further than the fence line. All gone now, claimed by fever and time. What remained was a man shaped by loss, steady but hollow, the way an old mesquite tree stands long after the heartwood has died. The evening deepened. A storm brewed to the south, black clouds piling high like mountains. Elias watched them gather, not with urgency but with the patience of one who has weathered too many tempests to fear another. Still, his eyes drifted often to the wagon road that cut across the prairie. Travelers were rare in these parts. Those who came either carried trouble with them or were running from it. It was there, in that falling light, that he saw her. At first she seemed no more than a mirage in the dust, a figure swaying against the horizon's haze. The wind pulled at her skirts, tore at the ragged shawl draped across her shoulders. Step by step she drew nearer, and the image hardened into flesh. A woman, slight but unbroken, her hair loose and tangled, braids fallen apart in the long miles behind her. Elias rose from his chair, the boards creaking beneath his boots. He did not reach for the rifle, not yet. Instead he stood still, as if uncertain whether this vision belonged to the living or to the ghosts that sometimes haunted men at twilight. The woman stumbled once, caught herself, and lifted her head. Hollow eyes met his, dark, searching, rimmed with the hunger of too many days without rest or bread. For a moment neither spoke. The prairie wind filled the silence, carrying grit between them. When at last her voice came, it was a whisper frayed thin, yet it carried as clear as a church bell through the stillness. "I have nowhere to go," she said. The words trembled in the air, fragile and final, like the last note of a hymn. She swayed where she stood, shawl clutched tight. Dust streaked across her face. Elias felt the weight of her gaze, and not pleading, not demanding, but simply laying bare the truth of her being. Something within him shifted, slow as earth beneath a plow. He had lived in silence so long he had come to believe silence was all there was. But here before him was a voice that carried loneliness equal to his own. The storm rolled closer, thunder grumbling across the plain. Elias stepped down from the porch, boots striking dry earth, and moved toward her. He did not yet know what place she might hold in his life, nor what changes her presence would bring. But he knew the course of his quiet days had been altered, as surely as the clouds gathering above would alter the night. And for the first time in many years, Elias felt the weight of choice press upon him. Loneliness had met loneliness on the wagon road, and the horizon no longer looked quite the same. The storm broke heavy over the land, drumming on the roof of the cabin as Elias pushed the door open for her. She hesitated on the threshold, her shawl clinging damp to her shoulders, rain threading through her hair in dark rivulets. For a breath she stood caught between the wilderness and the dim shelter of the room, as if unsure whether she belonged in either place. "Come in," Elias said, his voice low, steady, unused to company. She stepped across the worn boards. The lantern on the table threw a soft circle of light, and the fire in the stone hearth burned low, filling the air with the mingled scents of smoke and ash. The room bore the marks of a solitary man's life. Tools hung neatly on nails, shelves lined with jars of beans and flour, a single rocking chair facing the flames. Elias busied himself at the stove, setting the kettle and spooning out the last grounds of coffee. The familiar task steadied him, gave his hands purpose while his mind tried to reckon with the stranger now seated near his fire. He did not ask her name yet. Names were weights best carried after a measure of trust had been found. She sat stiffly on the edge of the stool, hands clasped tight in her lap. The shawl was torn at one corner, frayed where fingers had clutched it too often in fear or desperation. As the fire warmed her, she loosened it slightly, and Elias saw the lines of her arms, not delicate, but hardened, the skin marked with pale scars that spoke of work, of survival. When he poured the coffee and placed the cup before her, she lifted it with both hands as though afraid her strength might not be enough. She sipped slowly, steam curling against her face. Only then did Elias allow himself to sit, boots planted wide, watching the fire rather than her. "My people are gone," she said at last, her voice quiet, carrying the weight of finality. The winter took some. Riders took the rest. Elias did not ask which winter or which riders. In these lands, every family carried its own tale of loss. He only nodded, letting her words settle into the silence between them. "I have wandered too long," she continued after a moment, her gaze fixed on the cup. "I can cook. I can keep the house. If you let me stay, I will work." Her offer hung in the air like smoke. Elias heard in it not bargaining, but the bare edge of desperation. She was not asking for charity, only for a reason to keep her hands moving, to keep herself tethered to life. It was then, as she set the cup down, that he noticed her hair. Loose when she arrived, strands wild from wind and rain, it now slipped forward across her shoulders. Slowly, almost absent-mindedly, she began to weave it back into a braid. Her fingers trembled at first, then steadied, each loop and twist a small act of reclamation, as though binding herself together thread by thread. Elias found himself watching, the firelight catching on the dark strands, the motion quiet but resolute. He thought of the old tools hanging in the barn, of his rifle above the mantel, objects worn but cared for, carrying stories in their scars. She was the same. The storm outside raged, rattling the shutters, reminding them both of the wilderness waiting beyond the walls. Inside, the silence stretched long, but it was no longer the emptiness of before. It was heavy, yes, but shared now, as though two voices had found the courage to fall quiet in the same room. Elias leaned back in his chair, the wood groaning beneath him, and let the moment settle. He did not tell her she could stay, not yet. But neither did he send her out into the storm. That in its own way was the beginning. Two strangers bound not by choice but by necessity. Two scarred souls sitting before the same fire. Unspoken truths between them. The fragile thread of trust just beginning to take shape. Days found their rhythm on the ranch. Mornings broke pale and gold across the horizon. The land stretching wide and lonesome, wind brushing through the dry grasses. Marisol moved through the cabin with a quiet steadiness. She brewed coffee over the iron stove, the sharp, bitter scent filling the air. She mended shirts with small, careful stitches. In the patch of soil near the porch, she bent low to turn the earth, pressing seeds into ground that barely remembered rain. Elias carried his silence the way other men carried weapons. He patched fences, tightened wire that sagged with age, and set his hand to the old barn door that moaned against its hinges. When the evening sun slid low, he brought out the oil rag and tended his rifle with slow devotion. Steel gleaming dully in the firelight, they spoke little, but in the hush between them something began to grow. At night, memories rose like ghosts. Elias lay awake in the narrow bed, staring at the rafters, the creak of his rocking chair still echoing faintly in his ears. He remembered the war, the smoke, the thunder of cannons, the way earth itself shuddered beneath men's boots. He remembered faces of comrades buried in soil far from home, and sharper still, he remembered his wife, her laughter like bells in spring, her shawl hung neat by the hearth, the fever that stole her breath before their second harvest together. Grief had hollowed him then, left him living in a cabin stripped of warmth. Marisol too carried her shadows. In the dark, she heard again the cries of children, her younger brothers lost in raids when riders swept through their village, fire devouring homes faster than screams could be silenced. Winter stretched long in her mind, snow pressing against thin walls, hunger gnawing until even hope seemed a stranger. She had learned to endure, to braid her hair each morning as though weaving order against chaos, loop after loop a vow to keep moving. Sometimes Elias caught sight of her in the yard, fingers steady in the braid, and he understood. It was not vanity but survival, a ritual to remind herself she was still whole. In the barn, old tools hung silent, axes with rusted edges, plows that had not touched earth in seasons, a saddle stiff with age. They seemed relics of other lives, the kind both of them had almost lived and almost lost. When Elias passed by them, lantern light brushing the handles, he felt the weight of years pressing on him. And when Marisol brushed her hand across the plow one afternoon, she smiled faintly, though her eyes carried the ache of what might have been. One night, as the sky split with lightning, the cabin shuddered. Rain pounded the roof, wind howled at the shutters, and thunder rolled so close it shook the very timbers. Elias rose, set another log on the fire, and checked the latch on the door. Marisol sat near the hearth, shawl wrapped close, her face lit by firelight and fear not easily hidden. The storm raged louder, and for a moment the cabin seemed no more than a fragile shell set against the fury of the world. Elias glanced at her, at the steadiness of her hands, though her eyes betrayed unease. He felt something shift in him again, an awareness of how thin the line was between safety and ruin, how quickly solitude could be swallowed by the wild. He sat across from her, the rifle resting against the wall within reach, and let the silence stretch. Outside, the land tore beneath rain, but inside, two souls weathered the storm together. No words passed, but the unspoken truth grew clear. Survival, though fragile, was less so when shared. When the thunder eased and the rain softened, Marisol set her braid over her shoulder and breathed out, slow and measured. Elias leaned back in the chair, its creak sounding like time itself, and for the first time in years the silence in the cabin felt less heavy. They were not yet companions, not yet family. But in the dim firelight, as the storm gave way to stillness, they both knew the burden of solitude had lightened by the smallest degree. Shared silence, they began to learn, was easier to bear than solitary silence. The afternoon was too quiet. Elias felt it before he saw it, the uneasy stillness that pressed down on the ranch like the air before lightning. He sat on the porch, boots planted wide, the old rocking chair creaking beneath him. Across his lap lay the rifle, not raised but ready, as natural in his hands as the handle of a plow. From the south road, dust rose. 4 riders crested the low rise, silhouettes sharp against the sky. Strangers. Their horses carried the weary look of long travel, yet their eyes, when they drew near, held no weariness. Only the restless gleam of men searching for what was not theirs. Marisol stepped into the doorway, shawl drawn tight though the sun bore down hot. Her face betrayed no fear. She stood with her hands steady at her sides, gaze fixed on the approaching men. Elias felt her nearness like a second heartbeat, though neither spoke. The riders slowed at the gate, their leader tipping his hat with mock courtesy. "Afternoon," he called. "Storm's behind us. We'll take water. Maybe more if you're feeling generous." Elias rocked once, slow, the rifle still resting across his knees. "Water's in the trough. Help yourselves." The men dismounted, laughter coarse as they drank. Their eyes lingered on the cabin, on the woman in the doorway, on the stock of tools lined against the barn wall. Greed rode with them as surely as dust. One stepped forward, boots crunching on the dry earth. "A man with so much land and only 2 hands to work it? Seems to me you could use company. Maybe we stay a while." The firelight within the cabin glowed faint against the shadow of the door. Marisol did not step back. She stood tall, her shawl wrapped like armor, refusing the part of the cowering woman. Elias felt a thread of pride stir in him, quiet but fierce. His chair stilled its creak. The rifle rose a fraction, his hands easy but certain. His voice came calm, level as flat stone. "You've had water. Now take the road." The air tightened. For a breath all sound seemed to vanish but the rasp of wind against the barn boards. The men shifted, gauging the weight of his tone, measuring the steadiness in his gaze. It was Marisol, unflinching beside him, who tipped the balance. Together, without a word, they were a wall no wandering drifter could breach. At last the leader spat into the dirt. "No hospitality here." He swung into his saddle and the others followed, muttering. Dust swallowed them as they rode north, their shapes thinning against the sky. Silence returned, though it was a different silence, edged, lingering, as though violence had brushed its hand against the doorframe and might return at any hour. Elias lowered the rifle, his breath slow, his eyes drifting to Marisol. She met his gaze with a quiet steadiness that needed no words. That evening, the fire in the hearth burned strong, yet shadows clung close, reminders of what might have been. Elias set the rifle aside, but the memory of danger weighed heavy. Marisol sat across from him, her shawl laid over her lap, her braid falling neat against her shoulder. She had not flinched. He would not forget. The next day, Elias led her down to the riverbank where water moved fast over stones, silver in the afternoon sun. He carried the rifle, its barrel gleaming, and held it out to her. "Your turn," he said simply. Her hands closed around the wood, tentative at first, then steady. He showed her how to set her stance, how to lift the weight of it, how to breathe with the current of the water. The river whispered beside them, carrying dust and shadows away downstream. When she raised the rifle, her eyes fixed on the far bank, Elias felt something shift again. This was no longer his burden alone. In the flowing water and in her steady hands, he saw the beginnings of shared strength. Winter crept upon the desert like a quiet thief, softening the harsh edges of the land. Snow came not in great storms but in patient drifts, blanketing the sage and the fences, laying a white hush across the ranch. The wide horizon, once brown and brittle, now lay under a muted stillness as though the world itself held its breath. Inside the cabin, the fire never rested. Marisol moved with measured grace, hanging damp laundry on a line stretched near the hearth, steam rising from the cloth as snow tapped faintly against the shutters. She hummed sometimes, soft tunes without words, songs that seemed half memory and half prayer. Elias sat nearby, oiling the saddle that had seen more years of disuse than of riding, his hands slow and sure, movements born of habit more than necessity. One evening, while searching the trunk for a spare blanket, Marisol uncovered something unexpected. Beneath folded shirts and an old shawl lay a dress. Delicate, though time had yellowed its edges, lace still clinging stubbornly to the seams. A wedding dress. She paused, fingers resting gently on the fabric, the fire casting a golden sheen upon it. Elias froze where he sat, the rag in his hand suspended. His eyes darkened with a memory he did not speak. A bride long buried, a fever that had taken her, the hollow years that followed. Marisol lowered the dress back into the trunk with quiet reverence. She did not ask. She only closed the lid and set her palm flat against it for a moment, an unspoken gesture of understanding. When she looked at him, there was no pity in her eyes, only a stillness that seemed to ease something long clenched inside him. Life continued in small, steady ways. Bread rose on the stove, the smell warm and filling, the crust crackling when she sliced it. Coffee steamed in tin cups at dawn, their breath rising in faint clouds against the cold. The sound of her laughter, rare, hushed but real, slipped into the corners of the cabin like sunlight through a shutter. Elias found himself listening for it, marking the days by its presence. One night he noticed her shawl had frayed badly, threads pulling loose where the fabric had worn thin. The desert wind had taken its toll. Without a word, he went to the chest at the foot of his bed and drew out an old quilt, patched and faded but still warm. It had belonged to his mother, carried from Tennessee when she followed his father west. He handed it to Marisol, his movements awkward, almost uncertain. She accepted it with both hands, unfolding it slowly, her eyes tracing the stitched patterns. For a moment she pressed the quilt against her face, breathing it in, as though recognizing not only warmth but history. "Gracias," she whispered, the words soft yet carrying weight. Days later, Elias found her in the stable. His horse stood calm, steam curling from its nostrils, while Marisol stood close, fingers weaving the animal's mane into careful braids. She spoke to the horse in a low murmur, the sound gentle as though the act of braiding was not for decoration but for kinship. Elias watched from the doorway, his breath caught by the quiet intimacy of the scene. She had taken something of his and made it part of her own ritual of care. In those weeks the cabin shifted. It was no longer merely shelter against wind and snow. It began to feel like a home, shared not by necessity alone but by a growing, unspoken bond. Their words were still few, but their silences had changed, softer now, filled with the weight of presence rather than absence. The snow outside deepened, muffling the land into stillness. Inside, bread baked, quilts warmed, braids tightened, saddles gleamed, and laughter stirred faintly against the rafters. In these quiet acts, love began to take root, not declared but lived, as steady as the fire that glowed in the hearth. Spring came as a whisper before it was a shout. Snow melted from the sagebrush and seeped into the thirsty ground, coaxing green shoots from earth that had seemed lifeless for too long. The river swelled with the thaw, rushing fast, carrying winter's silence away. Birds returned, their songs tentative at first, then bolder, filling the mornings with sound. Elias felt the change in his bones. The ache of cold had left, replaced by the hum of work waiting on the land. Fences sagged where snow had pressed them, soil begged to be turned, and the barn called for repair. Yet this season was different. He did not move alone through his tasks. Marisol's presence wove itself into every corner of his days. She walked the garden rows with her skirts brushing against new growth, her braid neat and strong down her back. He watched her bend to the earth with care, pressing seeds into the softened soil, and thought of how she had pressed herself quietly into his life, steady and unrelenting, until he could not imagine the land without her. The rifle hung untouched above the door. Elias still cleaned it, still respected its weight, but the urgency in its presence had eased. It no longer felt like the only wall between himself and emptiness. Now there was another kind of strength in the cabin, one born not of steel but of shared endurance. Evenings became their sanctuary. As the sun burned low across the horizon, they sat side by side on the porch, two rocking chairs creaking in unison. The land stretched before them, breathing again, and the sky bloomed with color, gold bleeding into rose, firelight spilling across the far hills. Elias sometimes found himself listening more to the rhythm of her chair than to his own, comfort in the proof that he was no longer alone. The scars they carried remained, his gown the hollow carved by war and widowhood. Hers, the wounds of raids, winters, and wandering. Yet scars no longer ruled them. They were simply marks of survival, written into skin and memory but softened by time. Together they bore them with quiet acceptance. One evening, as the sky deepened to violet and the first stars pierced the dusk, Marisol broke the long silence between them. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, as if the words belonged more to the evening air than to him. "I have nowhere to go." The same words she had spoken that first night, trembling on the road, but now they carried a different weight. Not desperation, but reflection. A truth voiced out of habit, perhaps, though softened by the life that had grown around them since. Elias turned his head, studying her in the dimming light. Her shawl lay folded across her lap, her hands resting still upon it. He reached across the space between them, rough fingers closing gently around hers. His voice, when it came, was softer than she had ever heard it, yet steady with a certainty he had not known in years. "You are already home." The words settled over them like a blessing, like the final stroke of a long-forgotten hymn. Marisol did not reply at once. She only held his hand tighter, her gaze on the horizon where the last of the sun bled away into shadow. In her stillness, Elias felt the truth of it, that she had stopped wandering, and he had stopped grieving, and together they had found something worth calling home. Inside, the fire glowed steady in the hearth, its smoke curling upward through the chimney, rising into the open sky. The rocking chairs creaked in rhythm, no longer lonely, carrying them forward into a future not grand but whole. The desert had given them dust, storms, and silence. Now it gave them this, belonging, carved out of endurance, softened by care, sealed with firelight and quiet love. And as night gathered around the ranch, the cabin's glow stood against the dark, not as a fortress but as a home.